This is our 20th session, Energy Training Week, the second of which is virtual. It would be better, of course, to have all of you with us in Paris. I think that would be the ideal, but for obvious reasons, that is not possible. That said, our team has put in a huge amount of effort in order to try and make this as successful a training week as possible, given the circumstances. Based on the experience last time, I have to commend them for their ability to do so. It really worked out very well last time, and I'm hoping that that will be the same again this time. 2021 is a big year for energy. It's a big year for the International Energy Agency. We've characterized this year as the year of the clean energy transitions. Obviously, the clean energy transitions will take more than a year, but we feel that it's important to strike now in order to bring about the kind of inflection point in our energy systems that we feel is fundamentally important to get us on a more sustainable footing. In order to ensure that we do that, the role of statistics and data is fundamentally important for tracking, for policy assessment and evaluation, and for any policy reforms that need to be put into place. So your role as energy statisticians is fundamentally important in the coming years, which is why I think this training is so important. The IEA family is growing. This is the kinds of issues that we have to address in energy systems are shared problems that exist across all of our countries. We represent a high percentage of consumption and production of energy, but the percentage that we are representing through both membership and increasingly close relations with associates and with other countries is growing all the time. In fact, you're part of a network now of over 1,500 statisticians around the world who have taken these courses, developed shared interests, continue to share knowledge with us and with each other after the training. And we feel that is one of the most important roles that this plays. It helps us to all feel that we're part of a family, a network that will help us to make sure that the data that we have, the data that we provide to policymakers and to others is the most reliable, the most timely, the most robust possible. But it's of course a two-way street. I emphasize, and my colleagues emphasize to me all the time, that we get as much from you as you get from us in the course of this week. We learn a great deal. We also have then a community which helps us to populate our databases, what is in fact the global standard for energy data, to populate our databases in a manner which is consistent with the highest quality standards. So without further ado, I would just like to thank all of you for participating in this week. It's an honor for us to have so many people from so many different countries express their interest and willingness to do this course with us. I'm just having some difficulty moving the slide. One moment. Why do we collect energy statistics? Well, most of all, as I've mentioned, it's essential for all stages of the policy cycle to inform and design policies based on current and the current state of affairs and that which is foreseen in the near future. Adapt policy during its implementation. The data allows us, if necessary, to shift the boat in midstream if that proves to be necessary in order to ensure efficiency of those policy settings, and to understand policy performance, evaluate what happened and why it happened. There's a need for increasing cooperation among countries. I'm just going to very briefly shift my window so I can see this properly. My apologies for that. There's a clear need for increasing cooperation among the IEA family to address global challenges effectively. Raising the quality of global energy data and statistics also depends heavily on international cooperation. These are not words coming from us, these are words coming from our ministers. Our ministers have asked us to do this work, and by doing so, they've asked us to work with all of you in order to ensure that this work is undertaken. I'll just give some practical examples. It's one thing to say that it informs policy, but we have to think about it in a concrete way. All countries need to better understand the impact of market conditions and policy settings on a variety of outcomes of important policy relevance. IEA member, for example, IEA member countries have an obligation to hold 90 days of oil stocks, net imports over consumption. In order to figure out whether or not that is the case, in order to assess whether or not we have those 90 days, of course, very reliable and timely data is required on imports, consumption, and stocks of oil products. EU member countries, they have an obligation to a minimum share of electricity consumption from renewables. So we need reliable data on renewables. Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, we have to respect the engagement of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So we need reliable data on both supply and demand to ensure that that is the case. And these are just some examples. A number of countries have made commitments most recently to net zero by 2050. If we are to be on a trajectory which gets us there, then clearly having the data in order to monitor on an annual basis is fundamentally important. Some basic principles associated with energy statistics. First of all, determine the needs. We're the suppliers and the demand is coming from elsewhere. We have to know what that demand is, and we have to be in a position to respond to that demand appropriately. In order to do so, we need to ensure that resources are allocated to collect and process the data. Now, this, of course, is a big concern. It's very difficult for many of us in the statistics community to get the resources we need in order to do the work that we are being asked to do. And that's a continual struggle. An important aspect of that is ensuring that there's a legal basis in place. The legal basis provides the stick, the framework by which we can ensure that we're able to allocate the necessary resources. But that's not always enough. And we have to think about new ways of working, new data sources, new ways we can meet the demands, increasing demands that we face. So an important issue is exploring the use of administrative data, but also other data, scraped data, self-generated data, data available in from commercial sources that allow us then to corroborate, to develop some of the other sources of data, to make sure that we're on the right path. Establish a proper reporting mechanisms. Questionnaires which are as user-friendly as possible, leaving very little space for ambiguity, preferably no space for ambiguity, and not making the cost of implementation, filling in the questionnaires, excessively burdensome. As I mentioned before, a network of contacts is fundamental. We have that network needs to grow, and it is growing. And then, of course, an agreed timetable. Establish the proper dissemination mechanisms. There's no point creating the data unless it's available to all of those potential users who can help us to make sure that our energy systems are efficient and the markets associated with them are efficient. Review the methodology and the process to anticipate and adapt to changes. It's a moving target. All of the work we do is a moving target. Sort of the basis for much of this, as many of you are familiar, is the International Recommendations for Energy Statistics. I believe it was published in 2011, but as a result of a long period of gestation starting much earlier in about 2005, 2006. This is something that is important for all of you to consider as your Bible, really, in some sense, and it is the basis upon which many of the presentations, all of the presentations that you'll be seeing today, have been developed. We need to ensure consistency. We need to ensure that there's comparability across countries, across sectors, across fuels, if we are to fulfill our mandates. So the principles of data quality. First of all, relevance. How does the data serve the needs of the users? Accuracy. How close is the data to the true but unknown value? Credibility. Is the data and the data provider trusted? Accessibility. Is the data easily available in a usable format to users? This is something which has perhaps been not sufficiently closely respected in the past. Many of our countries have started to implement significant programs to make the data more easily available to potential users. Interpretability. Is there scope for ambiguity in the meaning of the data? That's where metadata is so important. Data is just a number. If it doesn't have metadata behind it, then it cannot be considered a proper statistic or data point. Timeliness. What is the lag between the phenomenon to be measured, fuel share, an emission, whatever it might be, and the provision of the data associated with that? Coherence. Are different data points mutually consistent across time and countries? And then cost efficiency. Are we allocating the resources most effectively in order to generate the demand that is placed upon us? Energy statistics side of the IEA. It's the backbone of the IEA, really. And the timeliness of the data is becoming increasingly important. So there's two elements to this that I'd like to emphasize. Firstly, the nature of the data that we have to collect is changing because our energy systems are changing. Secondly, we need to be able to respond relatively quickly as possible, with accurate data, bearing in mind all the potential trade-offs that exist between those two targets, in the face of important changes. An example, of course, is the pandemic that has struck us all, which is the reason why, of course, we're having to hold this workshop virtually. This is the IEA family. It's a big family, 30 member countries, but 8 association countries, 3 accession countries, and I would say good relations with over 100 countries across the world, at least in terms of data. We produce a whole series of products. The products that we're producing are going through constant change while keeping in line the necessity of having consistency over time. So we develop new products, we develop new ways of looking at the data, but we need to make sure that the time series that we have continue to be comparable over time. Non-member data collection. I'll just say a few words on that because this is fundamentally important. We have a mandate with our members, or the members have a mandate, have given us a mandate, which gives them the obligation to collect data of different types and forms. But our work, of course, with non-members is based solely on cooperation. Cooperation that is, we hope, mutually beneficial, and we are convinced is mutually beneficial. The fact that you are all here tells me that it is mutually beneficial. As I mentioned, over 100 countries, 120 countries and growing. This allows us to compile a world energy balance. So we can go beyond those countries who are obliged to provide us with the data to develop energy balances for others on the basis of cooperation. Collected in multiple formats, whatever the country can provide. We work with all of you in order to identify the best means to get the data into a form which allows us to make it comparable with other countries. In many cases, there's use of secondary sources and estimations when the country cannot provide the data. And there's communication with country contracts to help solve problems and confirm changes. Communication is essential. The Holy Grail. I've called this the Holy Grail. One energy statistics questionnaire for all. It will take us a long time to get there, of course, but we're already making significant progress in that regard. You can see the many regional and international organizations with whom we work in order to make sure that we're all working toward the same goal. Now, even if the questionnaire isn't identical in all different cases, it needs to be comparable at some level of aggregation. And that's where we devote a considerable amount of effort through our collaboration with the different institutions that you see listed here. I would argue that the IEA is at the heart of this effort to ensure that there's consistency across all these associations, just because of our very privileged position through the long history that we've had in this area. We also, of course, get outside energy in some sense, or the straight role of energy statistics, by supporting the global agenda in the realization of important global objectives. Sustainable development goals are a good example. We work in the area of renewables and energy efficiency, as well as energy access. My colleagues work in that area, as well as on the industry side, emissions in terms of value added. So we try to support international efforts with the development or ensuring that the indicators are robust and comparable across different countries. We're always looking for new sources of data. I give an example here of the Weather for Energy Tracker, which I encourage all of you to look at, which can be an important instrument that you can use in order to better explain what you're seeing in some of the energy data that you're collecting. And then we use this data In part, anybody can use this data, of course, but we like to ourselves, in part, in order to make sure that the kind of work that we're doing is valuable, is useful, is meeting the demands of the countries, analyze the data in a deeper manner. And this is just an example where we took the weather data and applied it to look at the effect of lockdowns in the course of the pandemic in a number of countries. And we did this for some association countries as well, including India, for example. But I've just given one graph here, which shows the effect that the lockdowns had on energy, on power demand explicitly. Capacity building. This is an example of capacity building, but we have many other examples. We do trainings in situ, so to speak, in different countries and with different groups. Obviously, that has been curtailed in the last year or so, but we continue to do so virtually, and we feel that our efforts to do so have been successful in ensuring that despite the pandemic, we continue to build capacity in energy data and statistics around the world. I think I'll conclude my speech there. We have a number of other slides. The slides will, of course, be shared with you. But I think that those are the essential points that I wanted to communicate, and I really wanted to get to the heart of the matter as quickly as possible. Having had some delays at the outset, inevitable delays, which I think are a reflection of the fact that we have so many participants that it can take some time to get the show on the road. So if I might add, I'll turn to my colleague Byuongho Jung, who will take us through the first concrete session, practical session, on the fundamentals of energy statistics. Byuongho?
Thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone. Before I start, I just want to make sure that my presentation is shown properly.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's visible.
Thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Byuongho Jung, and I'm happy to present the fundamentals of energy statistics today. This session is the broad introduction of our energy statistics training, and the knowledge we learn here will be very useful for the upcoming sessions for the next couple of days. So before I start, as mentioned earlier, there will be a separate Q&A session. But if you think your question is very essential and very urgent to be raised during the meeting, please use the raise your hand virtually raise your hand function under the reaction button. But depending on the version that you use, Zoom, some people might see that function under the participants button. So, or you can also use the chat function. You can type in any questions that you think very essential to be raised. So let me begin. So Nick just mentioned about the importance of our reference methodological documentation, which is International Recommendations for Energy Statistics. In short, we call it IRES. So it is adopted by United Nations Statistical Commission in 2011, and it defines the comprehensive framework, for example, the scope of energy, classification, units and methods, as well as data collection, institutional arrangement, quality assurance, and dissemination. So we really highly encourage all the people around the world that are involved in energy statistics field to refer and to follow the IRES guidelines. The link is seen below, so you can always search for that. So let me begin with the scope of our energy statistics. What's the boundary of our energy statistics? So the couple of bullet points are listed here. First, I'd like to mention the energy products. So what is the energy products? As we all know, this is the forms of energy suitable for direct use or products that release energies while undergoing combustions or other process. The thing I'd like to highlight here is that this is the form that we directly use, that we practically use. What does that mean? So let me give you one example. When it comes to the wind energy, we don't measure the kinetic energy of the wind. Instead, we measure the electricity production from the wind turbine. So this is our measuring point. This is the measurable fuel as electricity form that we want to include in our energy statistics. And the second bullet is mentioning about energy flows. This refers to the various activities of economic sectors in the national territory. It can be a production or trade or transformation or final consumption by the end users. So all the flows are defined based on IC classification, which is International Standard Industrial Classification, which you will see again in the later slides. And among these energy flows, there are two flows that I want to highlight here. One is the production. So production here is very important because this is our starting point. This is our measuring point where our energy statistics begins. So it is very important to note that only the marketable production should be included in the energy statistics. For example, let me give you one example of coal. So so there is a coal that needs to be washed to remove the impurities such as the soil or other ores. Then after removal of all of these impurities, after washing this coal, we report this washed coal in the as a coal fuel in our energy statistics because that is in the marketable status. Next bullet is about energy sector. This has very prominent role in our energy statistics because we are dealing with energy here, and all the transformation and production and distribution begin with this energy sector flows. So you will see later a couple of different players in the energy sector. So I will go a little bit more in detail there. And last point is the reference territory. What does that mean? We are only interested in what's occurring in the national territory. So it is very important to be aligned with this concept because this is related to the security of energy supply, for example. So this information is very key to make energy policies, for example. So assuming that we understand all of this, what's included and what should be excluded in our energy statistics, let's solve a short quiz prepared here. So I'd like to introduce to question one. I'm happy to invite you to the menti.com. I'm sure that you learn how to use it in our housekeeping rule session. I'd like you to go to the menti.com and use the code 5787-4799. So what I want to ask you here is what's included in our national energy statistics and balances, and what shouldn't be included here. There are 6 options here, but you can select more than one options. I see one participant giving an answer to us. Natural gas, and if there are 6 options. Natural gas used for heating, solar energy reaching Earth, methane emitted while mining coal, fuel wood burnt for cooking, electricity used while traveling abroad, which we don't really do right now because of pandemic. And lastly, natural gas used as ammonia feedstock. Okay, there are more than 20 participants giving the answer, we are seeing more and more clear target or the pool of answers right here for the first, fourth, and sixth options. Okay, I see almost like 30 participants giving yes, sir. So let me give you the answer. Right, still coming, yeah. Okay. Thank you for your really like heated participation. So let's share the answer all together. So the answers are these three, like natural gas used for heating and fuel wood burnt for cooking, and natural gas used as ammonia feedstocks. I think like almost most of you already like gave the correct answers. Then let's take a look at what shouldn't be included in our energy statistics and balances. First is the solar energy reaching the earth. I saw some of you selected this option, but this is not the answer because first, we cannot actually or practically track how much energy the earth absorbs from the sun, for example. And if you remember the boundary of our energy statistics in the previous slide, we need to define what's the energy product we want to collect the data on. So in case of the solar energy, we'd rather measure the electricity generated from the solar PV, solar panel, instead of the whole energy coming from the sun. For the methane emitted or fugitive while mining coal, this is very important data actually. But as mentioned earlier, this is not a marketable status. So this is not included in our energy statistics and balances. But I'd like to highlight that this data, of course, is very important to, for example, to track on the greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So from environmental point of view, this data would be better to be collected, but not mandatory to be included in our energy statistics. And lastly, electricity used while traveling abroad. There is one scope mentioned earlier, which is the territory reference. So, for example, electricity while we travel abroad, that consumption should be included in the nation that the actual consumption occurs. So this should be out of our scope. So how to bring all energy statistics together? The answer is here, the energy balance. So the energy balance is the synthesis of all kinds of information. We collect gas, electricity, coal, oil, and renewable data, and then we synthesize all together in the one piece of paper that shows the whole picture of the national energy situation. I put here the quote from our IRIS. This is an accounting framework or compilation of data on all energy products entering, exiting, and used within the national territory of a given country during a reference period. So based on this information, we can see which color this house is having or which shape this house it looks like. So this is very, very important information that everyone has to work on. Then let's have a look like how the energy balance look like. So energy balance is a two-dimension matrix that are composed of product and flows. First, let's take a look at the columns. So the columns are showing us the commodity itself by product. Here we see from coal to oil products, natural gas, and hydro. And this is quite aggregated level, but this can go into a more disaggregated level if there is a data. And if you look at the horizontal row, then it defines the flows of energy, the energy that goes through across the sections from production, below that the trade and stock changes, and below that oil refineries, etc. And the beauty, really like the most beauty of this energy balance is that it is balanced, arithmetically balanced, like horizontally and also vertically. So we can actually read horizontally or vertically, and we observe that all the numbers here are balanced out at the end of the day. And to do that here, we for the comparability, we used one single unit here. In this case, we used the KTOE, kilotons of oil equivalent, to compare each product, each flows simultaneously. And last point, there is a one column that is called total, and it defines the total energy. So yeah, this is very important information, especially when you derive the further indicators. You can use this total column as a key information. So first, let's take a look at the products columns. So as mentioned earlier, it is based on the standard classification of international energy products. And I put here the table that is introduced in the IRS, which shows us the whole energy products that we are interested in. So it is composed of several levels. On the very upper levels, like there is 10 sections from coal to nuclear fuels, and it can go more disaggregate level. For example, it also defines under the coal, anthracite, bituminous coal, coking coal, and other bituminous coal, and subbituminous coal and lignite, etc., etc. And if you look at on the right-hand side of the table, we also see that there are like matching of the code towards the other very famous code, which are CPC version 2 or HES code. So you can actually like compare with each other, and you can also correlate when you transfer from one system of code to the another. And let's take a look at what we have in rows. So it's the energy flows that I mentioned in the first session, in the first slide. So there are three main blocks here. First, it's a supply. Supply is composed of production, trade, international bunkers, and stock changes. And below that, we see that transformation and energy sector. And lastly, the final consumption sectors. And some of you hear that supply versus demand, then here demand refers to the combination of transformation and energy sector and final consumption sector. So let's take a little bit more detailed what's the energy supply blocks. So it is comprised of like production, trade, and this is very high level information. So based on this, we can make a table. As you see here, this is the table from one of our products, which is key world energy statistics. So based on production and trade data, in case of crude oil, we can list the countries, who is the producer of crude oil, who is the net exporters of crude oil, and who is the net importers of crude oil. And very key flows is shown here, which is total energy supply. We call it TES. So this is very important indicators. I would say this is the first estimation of how much energy is demand, how much energy is needed for the country to prosper. So here, one graph shown here, world total energy supply by geographical region. So this is very high level information that are really interesting. Let's go to the second block. which is transformation and energy sectors. This is our engine of our energy balance. So here we report what's the energy that goes into our power plants, for example, to produce another type of energy. In this case, there is a coal power plant shown here. When we put coal as an input to coal power plants, we report that with a negative sign, meaning that this amount of coal is input to the coal-fired power plant. And at the end of the table, we see also the output from these coal power plants. And from this, we can actually calculate the efficiency of the power plant. That is also very important indicators for us to when you process the data, because it shows the data quality checks. Of course, the type of technologies and other policies vary across the nation. So energy efficiency might vary, but there are certain range of efficiencies, expected efficiencies. So we can actually validate if the reported data are correct or not. At the second block, like there are two sectors actually I'd like to distinguish, and I also want to point out because this is the questions that have been asked like so many times from the users. So at the second block, there are two sections. One is transformation and energy own use. So giving you example will be a little bit clearer to understand the concept here. So transformation, we have here the oil refineries plants, and we input the crude oil to produce the oil products, such as gasoline or the other LPG. And let's say the crude oil that is transformed into another secondary oil product, we call this process as a transformation. However, we certainly need a certain amount of fuel that helps to run the machines and to operate the equipment. Here, fuel oil is used to run the operation. So in this case, fuel oil is considered as an energy industry own use, not transformation. And we have a last block, which is final consumption. So they are composed of many industry, many users, energy users. There are industry sectors as well. Here, this is aggregated as just one industry, but there are more disaggregated level based on the IC code. And you can see a transport sector, and we see the residential, commercial sectors, agriculture, fishing, and non-energy use. One thing that I'd like to highlight here is the transport sector, because this is the sector that is independently of the economic sector itself. So we really want to focus on the transport energy consumption itself. So for example, if there is a truck that are using the gasoline at the construction site, that amount of fuel should be included in the transport sector, but not in the construction flows, because we only want to focus on how much fuel is consumed by the means of transport. And lastly, like we see the non-energy use, there is a certain things that we need to remember. First, like fuel, if the fuel is used as a raw material, it should be included under within the non-energy use flows. One example is bitumen. So if bitumen is used to produce the asphalt to pave the road, it goes under the non-energy use. Same for other petrochemical process, for example, naphtha. If it is used to produce other plastic or petrochemical products, then it goes under the non-energy use. And the second bullet here point out that the biomass, for non-energy use of biomass, is not taken into account our energy statistics. This is the conventions that is used by IREDS. So I'd like you to keep in mind this concept here. this is the summary of the main energy flows. So this is the same concept of the energy balance. If we see the flows from top to bottom before, here we see the flows from left to the right. So on your left side, we see the marketed production. I highlighted the marketed here because it is the starting point, measuring point that we are interested in. And we see the export and imports, and there is bunkers and stock. On your right-hand side, we see the demand from transformation to the total final consumption. And obviously, if the reporting sources are different, then there should be the statistical difference. It is very natural to have a statistical difference, but at the same time, it is the key indicator to tell us if the quality of data, energy data, is good or bad. So it's not a very annoying concept. Annoying one, like if the statistical difference shows the plus or minus, then we can identify which energy data is missing either in supply side or demand side. If you want to try to visualize a little bit more beautifully, then we now have the Sankey diagram here. IEA websites shows you this Sankey diagram for all the countries. Here, the US case is shown here. It's same here. All the energy products starts the journey from the left side, and then in case of crude oil, it goes through the refineries in between, and then it ends up being used by the final consumption, as we see on your right-hand side of the table. So here's another quick question. Believe yourself, what is the largest energy consuming sector in the world? I want to invite you to the Menti quiz once again. The code is same. What do you think is the largest energy consuming sector in the world among residential, transport, and industry? I see industry like having more and more answer. Just note that like the answer here is not based on like what's happening in last year. So pandemic, the pandemic doesn't impact the answer of this question too. Okay, all right. Thank you very much for your participation. Let's go back to our presentation to share the answer with you. So surprisingly, yes, the answer is transport and industry, both accounting for 29% in 2018. So I think like some of you think that transport is not the largest energy consuming sector because the pandemic preventing us from traveling to abroad. That might be, I really want to know what's happening actually like in 2020. We will see a couple of cycles later. But based on 2018 data, it's interesting to see that industry as well as transport sector are the largest energy consuming sector in the world. And it should be also highlighted that the service sector accounts for 8%, and 21% comes from the residential sector. So these are combined together also accounts for 29%. And this is one of the fastest growing sectors in the world right now. Okay, so now it's time to learn a little bit more practical information here. So when we try to report data in the energy statistics table, sometimes we need a convergence. We need to convert from mass unit to volume, or volume to energy, etc. So there are a lot of like variables depending on the countries. Like there are a lot of preferred variables and units. So we need to keep in mind that the units are comparable, especially when you try to calculate or convert to the another data. So convergence involving same variables, for example, energy to energy, are fixed. It's always the constant value. One example is the 1 gigawatt hour is always equal to 3.6 terajoule. And IEA website provides you with the unit converter. The link is provided here so that you can use it for your work. And there is another conversion from mass to volume, and this is the densities. It varies across the fuels, it varies across the countries. So the range or the accuracy of the data is also is a key factors to contribute to the quality of the data. And lastly, we hear a lot of term here, which is conversion factors. So when we try to convert from mass or volume to energies, we use the calorific values. Here, example of crude oil is shown. Net calorific value of crude oil is ranging from 42 to 47 megajoule per kilograms. So the range, the accuracy of this net calorific value, we call it NCV, is very important to determine the quality of energy statistics. So let's take a look at a little bit more on calorific values. So here, once again, it converts from physical units to the energy units, or vice versa. So calorific values defines the heat obtained from the 1 unit of fuel when burned. As mentioned, it's very important key indicators for the quality of the data. It varies even by the flow. For example, production or export might have a different calorific values of the coal. So it is very important to keep in mind that this variation should be taken into account when you report the data. It also varies with the countries. So there is always the expected ranges. So it is a good tool to validate if the data reported are correct or not. I'd like to introduce one example here to calculate the NCV, the net calorific value of coal production. So here's one simple case here. One country has 2 coal mines, A and B, and both coal mines produce the same amount of coal, but with different calorific values. How do you calculate the total calorific value of the coal production in this country? The calculation is simple in this case. We can simply average those two, and we leading us to have 22.5 megajoule per kilograms. But the real life is not always easy like this. So this lead me to show you the next Menti questions. What if mine A produced 400 kilotons with 25 NCV, and mine B produced 100 kiloton with 20 megajoule per kilogram of NCV? So the code for this Menti quiz are same. Already there's one very fast front runner gave us one answer. Okay, it's equally distributed between 21 and 24 option. Okay, option 4 is becoming more and more dominant. Okay, I see many people giving the answer for the 24 megajoule per kilogram. Thank you very much for your participation once again. And let's see how do we derive this 24 megajoule per kilogram. So, PowerPoint. So it is weighted average that we use to calculate 24 megajoule per kilograms. So there are different amount of coals produced in the country. And in this case, we need to use the weight to take into account if the mine A here has a higher quality of coal with a higher amount of production, then this should be taken into account in the final net calorific values. So the generic formula for weighted average is shown here. We use the quantities and we use the calorific values, and using the formula here, we ended up with 24 megajoule per kilograms. But this was the very simple case. So if your country has a separate, for example, natural gas well, then having all this information for each natural gas well, you can calculate the total final net calorific value of the natural gas production. So it's coming to the end. I'd like to conclude to show you the benefits of the collecting energy statistics. So it's already mentioned by Nick earlier. It's very useful for the policymakers to for the formulation of energy policies, and also to monitor the national energy securities, and to for the planning of energy industries and long-term energy plan for the nation. It is also very useful, of course, for business community to track what's going on in the energy industry, and the general public is also interested in to have a better awareness of which energy and how much energy they actually use and how they contribute to have a better world. And based on this basic energy statistics, we can go further. We can derive user-oriented indicators, which is relevant to the economic, social, and environmental dimensions. I put here the table introduced in IRES. There are many various energy indicators to the linked to the economic dimensions. For example, here we see the energy use per capita. We can say that this is the energy intensity per capita, or we can also use, we can see the industrial energy intensities, or even household energy intensities. So depending on the need and demand of the energy policy, you can derive further these very economic and socio-economic indicators for your work and for your policymaking. And it can be visualized. This is the TES, total energy supply per population. So we can visualize how much energy is supplied per capita, depending on the countries. And another very important, globally, it is very, many people around the world are interested in the greenhouse gas emission. And from IEA, we are calculating the CO2 emissions based on the energy statistics that we collect. So we use the IRES guidelines, but also when it comes to the CO2 calculation, we use the IPCC methodologies to get the CO2 emissions from energy fuel consumptions. And lastly, actually, like there is a more need, for example, clean energy transition, SDG, etc., and it requires a little bit more detailed and disaggregate level of energy data collection. So here, one example, if you were to track the energy efficiency, then we need to adapt the existing energy collection systems, for example, to collect how much energy is actually used by residential space, or how much energy is actually used for residential appliances. So by having these more detailed and breakdown of information, we can have we can track the energy efficiencies, and this is very important because our collective objective as international organizations and energy statistician is to maintain the policy relevance of energy statistics. So we collect energy statistics not just for fun, but because to be remains as very relevant for the policymakers and other stakeholders that are interested in to get this information. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for still being with us. So I hope you like it so far. I'm with my colleague, Julia Guyon, and we're delighted to talk about data collection and data validation with you. So the point of this presentation is to give you an overview of how to implement a data collection framework, and then what are the steps that we usually go through to ensure that the data that we have collected is relevant for the users. So in terms of breakdown, we have two main parts. The first one corresponds to the first three points on this slide. So we will go through the main elements of the framework, what is really necessary to put it in place, and then what kind of data we can collect through it. And finally, what are the main attributes that we're looking for in the data that we collect. And after this, Julia will take you through all the those validation steps, how we make sure that the data we have is correct, how do we actually consolidate everything. And finally, she'll give you a couple of advice, recommendations, and then good practices should you want to have more information or even to do it on your side. So yeah, let's kick off with the main features of a data collection framework. When it comes to collecting energy, one of the main things we're looking for is a sound legal basis to do so, because this by using regulatory laws, you make sure that administrations have an obligation, a legal binding to submitting this data. But this is not sufficient on itself. You need also to collaborate with people involved to make sure that everyone knows his or her responsibilities and gets along in terms of roles and what to do. So there is a lot of interaction, collaboration, and discussions. And the next step in this process is to decide in terms of mechanisms how data should be collected. So the means used usually are questionnaires. We have to decide on what kind of data is being collected, the different flows, and who will be responsible of collecting this data, at what frequency. And when you do this kind of designing of the data that you collect, you also should always bear in mind that whatever additional you try to implement, you also have to allocate resources to it. You have to make sure that the requirements can be met, and people are in a position to do this collection and also can work on validating this data before they disseminate it. So this brings us to the concept of cost. So whatever you try to implement in addition to what currently exists has an incurred cost, and you should always do this assessment of cost and benefits in adding something new. So obviously there is a cost in doing something new, but you can also have sometimes a cost in not doing something. What I'm trying to say is that you might have like a potential gains in efficiency, for instance, or whatever. And if you don't collect the data, you do not have this information, you cannot put in place the new measures, and you actually also pay a sort of price by not doing it. When you try to implement those new things, you very often face obstacles. Those obstacles, those challenges, they're mostly due to the liberalization of energy markets. In the past, there were many, there were much less flows involved in energy markets. It was easier to collect the information at the country level. Now you have many more sources involved. You have much more competition, so that can also lead to confidentiality issues. And as we mentioned before, the growing number of data points also means that you need to adapt the resources that you allocate to the processes to collect this information. So sometimes there is simply not enough, resources in administrations, or not enough budget, or the fact that people working on those topics tend to change a lot. So there is not enough build up in terms of knowledge and experience, to develop over time good statistics. So I think for the main features, this is it. We try to represent what we call the data chain. So a data chain is basically all the steps that take place from the energy action. So the physical reality that is going to translate into a data point. There is an information that has to take place at this point, and then all the steps that take you to the final data user of this information. So initially what happens is that you have a physical reality, some fossil fuel is being produced, or you try to convert an energy form into another one. And this translates into an information, and it's being collected at the primary level by countries. So it's being measured or through surveys or another source of data. The country does the aggregation and then communicates it to the secondary data collection framework, which are international organizations. You've seen a couple of them in previous presentations already. The IEA is one of them. And then there is some work that's being done here again in terms of aggregation and validation of the data. And in turn, this is being disseminated to data users that, as you can see, are very various and different. You can have people, you have all those policymakers basically who shape up their policies based on this information. You also have people doing research in academia. You have people using this information with commercial perspectives and so on. So all this value chain has a very important aspect that we want to highlight here, is that you find many stakeholders throughout the value chain. As you can see here, there are many interactions, and with the growing number of data and information, it's very essential. I'm almost done. It's very essential that you can move smoothly from one point to another. So what we really wanted to highlight is the importance of collaboration, to the extent that you can no longer focus only on one part of the chain, on only one stakeholder that might have detailed information at his level, but when you want to have the entire picture of what's going on, you really need to aggregate and consolidate all the information. So that's why collaboration is key to that extent. Now I just would like to have a short, Menti question. The idea here is to ask you with which institutions you do collaborate. So take a second to go on the website and enter the answer to this question. I'll try to share it as well. So let's see on the screen. So bear with me, I'm trying to share the answers.
Let me know if you want me to share the answers, Louis.
Yeah, do you have access to it? I don't seem to.
Yes, you just need to stop sharing your screen, please.
Okay. Should be good now.
So everyone, if you go to www.menti.com, and you use the code 60491269, then you are able to enter the answer to the question. Louis, do you see my screen?
No,
Huh, that's interesting.
you should turn off your screen.
Louis, did you stop sharing?
Yes, right now. Sorry for that. I think the code. Okay, there seemed to be an issue with the code. I just put it in the chat. Sorry for that.
So we see the first answers coming in.
It's a good first answer. I like it. Yeah, I think we should stop there.
Yeah. Okay. So again, the point here is really to highlight the diversity of stakeholders, like who intervene throughout the data chain, and highlight the importance of every one of them. You basically cannot reconcile the entire picture if you're missing a part of the chain. So, well, as you can see, well, there is a lot of IEA, I guess, but as you can see, you have many different names. I don't know all of them. Some are quite generic, some are more specific, but this really highlights this diversity. I think we can move on to the next section. I'll take over again the screen sharing if that's okay. Okay. So yeah, the code was wrong. Sorry for that. Okay, so we've seen the main features of the collection system, and now
we don't see the PowerPoint. We see the presenter view.
Okay. Bear with me. Is it fine this time?
Well, we still have the.
Now it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine? Okay.
Yes.
So sorry. Okay, so now we try to look at the different type of information that we can collect in this collection framework. So when it comes to energy, you always have this dichotomy between supply and demand, and it's the same in terms of data collection. You have on the supply side companies and industries who contribute, to producing or generating trade flows and so on. So we use the surveys and when available administration data to reconcile that information and have a broad picture of the country's balance. On the consumption side, the work is a bit more complex because of the nature of the flows and the number of again, stakeholders involved in on the consumption activities. So we also use surveys, this time targeted to households and enterprises involved in consumption. And here we also need to have a more integrated approach overall by relying not only on surveys that we design, also on administrative data, but sometimes also we need to fill the gaps and resort to estimation and modeling of the missing information. So I'll go a bit more in detail in the next couple of slides in terms of what surveys and administration data we can collect. So administrative data, I think that the name is quite self-explanatory, is data that is being managed by governments and that, can be done by public or private companies on behalf of governments. But the idea here is that this data is already being collected by a third party. So when you think in terms of collection, you don't need to design anything new and implement it. It's already being done by someone else. So this is an advantage because it's lighter in terms of work that you have to input in designing the framework and doing the work. At the same time, one of the main drawbacks is going to be that you might develop a dependency on the third party that does the work of collecting this data. In terms of pros and cons, so as I just said, it lowers the burden of the collection procedure, but it might also develop a dependency. And even though you find a lot of information in those administrative data, it isn't always necessarily in the right format or shape that you need it to be. You might have differences in the definitions, in the coverage. Actually, it's pretty much always the case. So even though it avoids, doing the work twice and putting more resources to doing it, there is still a need to put some effort in matching this with what we really want to see. And so it's not that straightforward. You need to integrate it to the framework. Companies that contribute to administrative data can be metering companies who collect the data when they supply energy to consumers, or all the companies that are involved in those activities usually report to an authority, and by doing so, they have the obligation to report statistics on their activity. So that's also a source of information that's very useful. In terms of surveys, this time we distinguish two main types of surveys: enterprise surveys and household surveys. Here, in terms of enterprise surveys, it's very important because it helps us to track over time consumption, and also to derive metrics in terms of efficiency, or to model and derive estimations of the greenhouse gases emissions, and other indicators that can help tracking the impact of policy measures that have been put in place. On the household end, you distinguish three types of information that you try to collect. First, obviously, in terms of end-use energy consumption. So we try to collect information about the heating for space, water, and so on, cooking, and etc. But you also want to have additional information in terms of the housing stock itself, what kind of structure we're talking about in terms of buildings, what's the age of the thing, what kind of insulation it has, and so on. And finally, you also want to collect information about the household, the people who live there, what's the size, what's the profile in terms of income, what is the occupation intensity, and so on, all this kind of information. Finally, when using those data sources, something I briefly mentioned in introduction is sometimes you face confidentiality issues. Put simply, it is the issue that you might face when by disseminating statistical information, you give the possibility to some data users to back engineer the information in terms of economics and commercially speaking. So they can derive information if there are competitors and things like that. And some companies actually are against sharing this data for those reasons. So most of the time we would try to come up with a solution to make sure that we can still access this information that is available and that exists, but in a way that prevents people from doing what I just said. Finally, in this section, data quality. So this was already introduced, I think, in Nick's introduction earlier. But when we collect data, we don't try to collect everything that we can just for the sake of it. There is always the idea that the data collected should be useful in terms of final users. And whenever you think of a data point, you should also ask yourself, is this going to be useful? So the characteristics we try to make sure that we have are first the relevance. So is it going to be useful? But even though the data point you collected is relevant, is it accurate and reliable? If it's most of the time like far from the reality, it's not very usable. So it might not be a good thing to eventually collect this data point. Also, in terms of timeliness, if the data you collect is relevant and accurate and reliable, but still you only get the data point 20 years after the energy action took place, it might be questionable to know if it's worth putting resources in collecting this data point. Accessibility and clarity here, the thing is that the data we disseminate, we want it to be understandable. And that's why it's very important to publish it along with metadata and other methodological notes that help understanding what's going on. And finally, coherence and comparability. As one of the final uses of this data, most of the time is to derive policies and this kind of work. And if you want to be able to derive robust and solid conclusions, you also need to have this comparability across regions and across time. So those are the 5 main things that we look for when we collect data. At the bottom of this slide, you have some sources of information where you can find additional guidance in terms of methodology, definitions, and yeah, I invite you to consult them should you want to do so. Before letting the floor to Julia, I think we can have a short break here in case you have pending questions, but otherwise, so feel free to ask quick questions at this point, and if not, you can still ask them at the end of the presentation. It's really up to you. I'll just have a look at the chat to see if so far there was something. Otherwise, I invite you to take over, Julia.
Nothing so far, Louis, but as Louis mentioned, please feel free to come back to Louis after Julia's presentation in the event that things occur to you in the interim.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis. Yep, sorry. So we have seen how important it is to have good data quality. Now we will see how this is feasible and what we can do to increase the data quality in the end in our data set. We will start with some balance checks. Byuongho has introduced the concept of the energy balance to you. And once you have the energy balance, you can have a look into details in the internal consistency. Some things that you will have to look out for is if one field is supposed to be the sum of 2 others, is it really? Does the detailed breakdown match the total? For example, this could be for trade or for demand data. Are the stock changes correctly calculated? If you have decided to calculate them in a specific convention, is this used, and is this used consistently? Is the data set complete? Is there, when there is a decrease in use of one fuel, a coupling with an increase in use of another one, or another explanation like efficiency improvements? And finally, in general, is the story logical? For example, if you know that your country is a big coal producer, do you see that in the energy balance? And in general, it is good practice to analyze the data processes to identify possible points of failure and introduce checks. This is, for example, with the process A, where we have extracting fields, summarizing data, reformatting data sets. So this is something quite manual. And here, 1 or 2 items could be dropped from the large data set quite quickly. So it is good to compare before and after counts and totals of data in order to make sure that you don't drop any data points, because afterwards it's going to be more complicated to identify where this is coming from. Let's introduce the data validation aspect with a quick Mentimeter question. So I'll move to the Mentimeter, go to the website that you all now know and use the code 60491269. And look at this energy balance table. This is only the supply of the energy balance table. And tell me if you see any obvious error. So here we're talking consistency. And I'm gonna show, yeah. So we have first answers coming in, total stock changes, not stock change of natural gas. It's one of the answers. Then the 100, 102 biofuels. Biofuel doesn't balance. I'll wait a bit to let you have the time to have a look at this energy balance table and see if there is anything worth mentioning. Okay, we have again the mention of the stock changes of now the trade. This is in crude oil, I think, which is mentioned. More and more answers coming in. Yes, so we have a lot of mentions of the biofuels and of the stock changes. I'll wait a bit more because we only have 16 respondents. Okay, so I think we have quite a consensus here. I'll come back to my presentation to show the answers. So as you've correctly seen, we have a problem with the biofuels in waste. We have 100 in production. We have nothing in imports, exports, bunkers, and stock changes, but we have a 102 total energy supply. So this doesn't add up. And if we look at the total of the total energy supply, we also don't see this 2 there. So there's obviously a problem here. Then someone mentioned this as well. So it would be worth mentioning to the data provider that this seems a bit fishy. We have 2000 KTOE as imports and the same quantity exported directly. Might this be transit? That would be something we would ask. And then we have a third point, which I think is missing on my slide here, but you correctly identified it. The stock changes of natural gas with 250 KTOE are wrongly calculated in the total, where we have only 50 KTOE in stock changes. So very nicely done. Congrats and thanks for participating. We'll continue now with the balance checks and we will talk about statistical differences. I know that you've already discussed this with Byuongho, but just to put it out there that this is really an aspect that helps you validate your data. Indeed, when we collect energy data, we try to get a picture of supply and demand in the market, and we would think that the market is in equilibrium, supply is equal to demand. The supply is how much is available to the internal market. The demand is how much was consumed in the market. The problem in practice is that measuring supply and demand comes with many challenges, and we often have different sources of data for the supply and the demand side. And the statistical difference basically measure the level of mismatch between the collected supply and demand data. And they can be, if they are very high, a red flag, often when it's more than 5 to 10% of the deliveries to the market. But as mentioned by Byuongho previously, a statistical difference of 0 is also suspicious because we wouldn't want to hide the statistical difference into our data. We would want to show it to show, okay, we have different sources. This is what is coming out of it, and then try to work with the different sources to reduce the statistical difference. So what can one do? One should check the completeness and coverage of the data, review the definitions and methods of data sources, check the calorific values for supply and demand, because these could be a reason for a high statistical difference, and check if there are any new trends missing. For example, if you know that the country in the past didn't have solar PV, but it now has, maybe that is something that is missing because it wasn't integrated in the template for data collection yet. And so that's something to double check. Then another aspect to look at is the on use and the losses, especially for electricity. These are values that shouldn't vary too much across time. The on use of electricity by power plants, that's the proportion, that's the electricity, used by power plants to function, basically. And it's not expected to vary significantly year on year. We would say maybe around 3%. And if in your country it has been for the whole time series higher or lower, as long as you can explain it, that's fine. But what we would ask about, what we would try to flag is if we have a very big peak or a very big decrease. For example, in the graph here, in the dark blue line, we see that around 1994, we have a peak in the on-use, and around 2005, we have a drop. This is something that we would want to ask what happened there. The same for the transmission and distribution losses. This is the electricity that is lost during on the way, basically, to the consumer. And here as well, we would say that the technical transmission and distribution losses should stay below 10%. It could be that those go higher if we have problems with the maintenance of the grid or problems with theft. But again, here it's important to explain these differences. I'm coming now to the calorific values. So calorific values, as you've seen before, are essential to build an energy balance as they convert from the physical to energy units. And for every energy product, we expect to have the calorific values in a specific range. Coal calorific values won't have the same range as gas calorific values, for example. And so it's good as a first validation to compare the collected calorific values against the default. It's also good to have a look at the historical calorific values for the product, as they can be region specific. You have on the right, on the bottom right of the slide, an example where you see that depending on the region, we really have quite a strong difference. So this is New Zealand and Kazakhstan. And last but not least, check if the calorific value used for consumption is in line with the one used for supply. If it is not, this might lead to statistical differences. Then to analyze the time series, it is very useful to compute growth rates. I think all of you might already have done this. A growth rate is computed quite easily by taking the current period minus the previous period and divide it by the previous period. And to have it in percent, we multiply by 100. This involves comparing the data point of the latest period to that of the preceding periods. And this can be very useful to see if there was any unexpected trend. It is important to note that when the seasonality is strong, or we are dealing with monthly data, it makes more sense to compare the current months with the same months of the previous year, just to be sure to compare apples with apples. And this is a comparison that is very useful for production, for consumption, but less so for stocks and trade that are very variable. Then we will try to make sure that the data set is coherent, that it matches the expectations for trends. For example, if we know there is a maintenance or weather disruption, do we see this in the data? Then some patterns may be fuel specific. For example, we see it here in the right graph. Sweden imports much more natural gas in the winter months because that's when there is more demand for heating because there are colder temperatures. So there is a seasonal trend in the natural gas imports in Sweden, and we would want to see this reflected in the data. Oil and gas fields, as another example, follow cyclical maintenance patterns. So this is also something to consider. And then we would want to check in our questionnaire if the data is matching similar data in another questionnaire. For example, if we have an input of natural gas to electricity, does it match the one reported in the electricity questionnaire? And last but not least, in most cases, among the different variables, there are relationships, and we would want to satisfy them. For example, if inputs are increasing, we would expect the outputs to increase as well. And if that's not the case, we would want to be sure that this is a result of something that we can explain, for example, improved efficiency. So then we can compute the efficiency to make sure this is the case. Let's talk now about breaks in time series. They can happen when the coverage improves or the methodology changes, but in general, we would aim for a consistent time series. And each time you have an unexplained break or a big change in the trend, we would want to explain this. Breaks in stocks, for example, also are rare and should be investigated. And for certain flows, they are more consistent over time. And in these cases, sudden increases or decreases should raise a red flag. And in that case, we would consider going back to the data provider and ask what is the reason of this break. We have a good example in the right side of the graph, the right side and the bottom, the refinery intake in barrels per day. So we have the time on the x-axis, and we see two big outliers. One is in April 2005. This is much lower, and one in December 2005, much higher. The first one, the lower refinery intake, could be explained if the refinery was in maintenance at that time. However, the other one, the December 2005 one, is much more difficult to explain because a refinery intake in a refinery is usually quite constant because the refinery has been calibrated for a specific intake and cannot take more than that. So that would be really something that we would want to ask and check if there is not a problem with this data point. I've mentioned efficiencies before. We will have a look now at how they can help us validate the data. For every energy transformation process, you have an input and an output. And there is a relationship between these that will depend on the technology used. If we check this, we ensure the consistency of our data set and we ensure that the relationships are satisfied. The efficiency is calculated as the total useful output over the total input. And this should always be in net energy units. For example, if we have a transformation process of fuel to electricity with the inputs A and B both in terajoule and the output C in terajoule, the efficiency will be calculated as C over A plus B, whereby, important to note, it should be the same energy unit and the same energy form, so net or gross. Then, once we have computed the efficiency, we will be able to check it against the expected ranges for the process and technology. The first point is, if you have an efficiency larger than 100%, that's very implausible. Then we will look at the ranges. They can be dependent on the type of plant and on the fuel used. And they will vary depending on the state of technology. An older plant will usually have a lower efficiency. And they should not vary significantly from year to year because technology upgrades are time and capital intensive. So except if you have a new power plant coming online and then you should see an increase in efficiency, you should have a quite consistent time series in the efficiencies. Let's put this into practice and go back to our Mentimeter. Up. I'll go, yes. So the question is, what is the efficiency of the refinery? I'll show you the image for a while. So you have here an extract of the energy balance where we only see the transformation sector. And if you go to the line oil refineries, you will be able to find the information you need to compute the efficiency of the refinery. So I leave you some time. I hope everyone found the code. So it's 60491269. I see first questions coming in. I will share them in a minute, just keeping the table for now so that it's easier for you. So we have several answers. The majority is saying 105%. No one is saying 100%. We have a few people for 95%. Very few for 80%. Answers keep coming in. Okay, so a majority is voting for the 105%, but quite a few people also answered 95%. So we'll have a look. The correct answer was 105%, and I will explain now why. So the correct answer is 105%, because the efficiency is calculated as the output. The output here is the 10,000 kTOE divided by the input, which is the 9,500 kTOE. Here, as we are in an energy balance format, we already have the right units. We don't need to convert anything. We have an energy unit and it's all in net calorific basis. So we only need to take the output, 10,000, divided by the input, 9,500, which gives us the 105% efficiency. So as is mentioned in this slide, this would raise a flag because we show refinery gains in energy term, which is not possible. So this is something we would go back to the data provider or first check in our data if we didn't make a mistake, for example, in the conversion factors. So I'm going to now talk about the use of different data sources and data sets, which can help you try and identify and consistency in your data. First of all, note that there are different product classifications. Goods can indeed be classified using 3 systems: the harmonized system, the standard international energy product classification, or the central product classification. And if you have different sources that report using different product classifications and you don't adjust, this can lead to discrepancies in data. Then it is good, if you have the data, to mirror checks, particularly useful for data sets with a bilateral component. This could be, for example, for trade, as you see on the right graph. Here we have the electricity trade, always from country A to country B, but reported one time by country A, so this is the blue line, and one time by country B, this is the red line. We see that over the years, it has always been quite consistent. And then at the end, we have a big break, a big difference between the 2 countries. So this is something where we would go and try to identify what is the problem here. This is something we can help you with. If you want to identify partner countries, we can try and help you work with them to mirror the trade data. Then on the granularity, it is very helpful sometimes to have monthly data in order to validate the annual data. You can check if the aggregate of the monthly or quarterly data makes sense with the annual data, and watch out, of course, for difference in coverage and definitions. So here in the example, we have LPG. The green is the monthly and the blue is the annual. We see that for 3 years, the data was quite consistent, with the annual always being a bit higher. This can be explained quite easily if we have coverage problems as the monthly data is collected in a quicker way, with less time lag, it might be more difficult, to have a complete coverage of the country's data. So that's explainable. What we see though in 2016 is that we have a real drop between the annual and the monthly. So that's something we would watch out for. And then economic data can also be useful to show you how consistent the data is and to try to explain some events. For example, when the financial crisis in 2009 happened, this was really visible both in the energy data and in the GDP data. And so you could really explain this by looking at the two data sets. Last but not least, if you don't have the data, you might need to estimate some missing data. Of course, we always prefer to have the data that is submitted being real observed data. But if you don't have one data point, a small proportion of the balance, it is possible to estimate it. Estimation should only be used for a short time, whilst you prepare a system of data collection using the steps that Louis mentioned before. And then the strategies will depend on whether the data needs to be systematically estimated or if a data point is missing exceptionally. And of course, whenever a data point is estimated, this should be clearly marked, and the metadata should give more information about that. In general, when we estimate a missing data point, we should ask the following questions. First of all, how important is the flow or the product? Then is it correlated with another flow for which there is data? This might help you to make an accurate estimation. Is there a seasonal or historical trend? Here again, if you have very clear pattern, it might be easier to estimate. And then why may this period be different? If you use for 2020 estimations, the pattern of the years before, you might not have a correct estimation because of the COVID-19 crisis. And then can market trends be used as an indication? So basically really try to make a scope of all the information available out there to help you do an accurate estimation. Last but not least, recommendations and assistance. I'll quickly talk about some items that can help you when you do your data collection and validation. So first of all, we would recommend that you should have a solid legal foundation for your data collection system. You should establish a network of different institutions that you work with, both with members of national energy statistics and with partnerships outside the ministries, secondary data sources, etc. We've seen that a lot of you already work with several institutions around the world. Then one should build up formal procedures to support confidentiality, to protect the data, but also to get access to the data. Establish a data collection strategy. Provide up-to-date metadata so that the user can understand what is behind the numbers. And implement international standards and concepts to have comparability. You can see some examples of how other countries do it in the country practices database, which is regrouping all kinds of methodologies. So surveys, modeling, measuring administrative sources used by the countries. And you can, of course, also share your own expertise if you see that it's not there. Yeah, this is an example of how it's used. For example, if we want to see residential surveys, we can go to this country practice database, and then we'll have a list of all the countries that have implemented and shared their practice and how they did it. For example, here we have the survey used by Canada, and this is really an example of how one can benefit from each other's work and try to exchange on best practices. Finally, beyond data collection, we have a lot of data disseminated. We have data services for purchase, but if you go on our website, you can also find a lot of data available for free. And all the data that we produce is feeding in the different reports of the agency, so the World Energy Outlook, the Global Energy Review, different market reports, COVID-19 impact on electricity reports, etc. So I'll invite you to have a look at our website. And that's all from me. I hope that this was clear enough and that you have a better idea now of the practices for data validation and collection. And of course, there will be time for questions now. Thank you very much.